Good afternoon and welcome to this CLA webinar, which is kindly supported by Hipcamp. This webinar is on diversifying your business, an introduction into camping and glamping on your land. And there's no better time to be tuning into this webinar, as hopefully we now have COVID and winter in the background, and many of you are looking at this season for an additional source of income to replace BPS or just to help your business going forward. My name is John Greenshields. I'm a chartered surveyor working for the CLA and I'm based in the Midlands. Today I'm joined by Jonathan Knight, UK Country Manager at Hipcamp. He is the founder of Hipcamp as well and has over 20 years experience in this industry, so we're grateful for his time. We're also joined by James Warner Smith. James is an author of several books in this area, and he's canoed from the Atlantic all the way through to the Black Sea, which was quite a feat, I'm sure you'll all agree. So today's running order will be Jonathan providing us with an introduction into Hipcamp. I will then be talking about some planning considerations, and then James will be discussing a business case for any glamping or camping sites. So today there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the event. In the bottom, there should be a bar with the Q&A function. So please put any questions in here and we will look to get to them. Any questions we don't get to today, we'll hopefully try and get back to you. This webinar is recorded so you can revisit it at any point. And it's worth reminding you that you can contact the CLA to discuss any matters that are covered today, but I'd also strongly encourage you to contact Hipcamp further down the line. So without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Jonathan.
Thanks, John, for the introduction. And yeah, thanks for having us here today. It's good to see that so many people are interested in this topic. I think we've had over 350 people register for today's webinar. So yeah, camping is obviously something that many of you are considering. Before I talk about what camping might look like on your land and why you might consider setting up a campsite, I should probably just briefly explain who we are, why Hipcamp have been invited to talk to you today. And if you haven't heard of Hipcamp, we are the world's largest provider of outdoor stays. So not only camping, I mean, camping is the biggest part of our business in terms of volume, but glamping has become hugely popular over the last kind of 10, 15 years since we've been doing this. So anything from bell tents, safari tents, shepherd's huts, up to kind of, cabins or tree houses, really quite impressive structures. But really, we're talking about anything that connects people with nature, anything that gets people back out into the outdoors and enjoying nature. But Hipcamp is essentially a bookings website. We've had over 7 million nights booked on our platform so far, and we're growing pretty quickly. But we're known for focusing more on those kind of smaller, unique, independent campsites and outdoor spaces. So lots of farms and small holdings and country estates. We don't really have so many of the larger camps, large caravan parks or holiday park chains on our platform. Our campers tend to be looking for those smaller, more unique places where they can sort of find some quiet time in the countryside. But as well as helping campers find their sort of dream pitch, if you like, we also, the other part of our job is to help landowners like yourselves to welcome campers to their land. And in particular, we help people who are new to camping or glamping launch their business and connect them with the millions of campers that we have using our website. And part of our mission there, I guess, is to make life easy for you guys to set up a camping site if that's what you want to do. And we do things, for example, we do things like offering liability insurance as part of our product. So if you don't have any liability of your own, that's part of what you get with Hipcamp. We also have like a damage protection policy. So if a camper comes to your, maybe stays in some glamping accommodation, breaks something, we'll cover the cost of that. And other little useful things as well, like a photography program. We have quite an extensive professional photography program. So we'll send a photographer to your site, take some nice photos and help you showcase your land in the best possible way. And obviously that will help to drive more visitors, more bookings for you. So quite a few benefits that we offer to help make your life easier when you're offering camping, perhaps for the first time. And also, you may not have heard of Hipcamp, because Hipcamp is a relatively new brand in the UK, but we formerly operated as Cool Camping. So you may have heard of Cool Camping. We were Cool Camping up till spring last year when we joined Hipcamp. So Cool Camping was just in the UK with some campsites in France as well, but mainly kind of marketing to UK campers. But Hipcamp is a global platform, so they were already present in America and Canada, in Australia and New Zealand as well. So we've kind of joined that larger family, and that gives us kind of network effects and bigger resources to be able to kind of, you know, spread our net wider. But as Cool Camping, we've been doing this for over 15 years, and our mission there was just to put camping and glamping on the radar, to make it cool again. And we originally started with guidebooks, actually. So we had a guidebook series, which was kind of seeking out the best places to go camping in the UK and then in Europe. And then gradually we started being a bit more active online, and then that became a bookings website. But, you know, right through this process, we've always been about promoting camping and glamping. And we were really there at the forefront of the, you know, the advent of glamping. And still to this day, you know, the national press come to us for commentary on glamping and camping and other issues. So we're quite often either writing for the Times or the Telegraph or the Guardian, or commenting on some kind of news relevant piece. So, for example, during COVID, there was this temporary relaxation of the planning laws that allowed farmers to set up a campsite on the land for up to 56 days, which was a big extension of the 28-day period that they were allowed to before. And so they, you know, we were involved in the commentary on that. Because there was quite a big explosion, or a mini explosion, if you like, in pop-up sites for that period. So it became like a newsworthy item. So within the industry, we're known as kind of the voice of camping. So that's us, Hipcamp. But if we just go to the next slide, thank you. And so I guess why we're here today is to talk about why it's a good idea to offer camping, why you might want to offer camping on your land, what the potential benefits are to you. And I think one of the most asked questions is there still demand, you know, for camping? Is, you know, what's the level of demand like? And basically, so with the pandemic, for that kind of 2-year period during the pandemic, there was a massively elevated demand for camping. Obviously, we were kind of in lockdown mode. People weren't allowed to travel overseas. So camping suddenly became this activity that people were still allowed to do, and it was easy to do, and it was also a kind of safe activity, being outdoors. So we did see a huge boom in camping and glamping, all outdoor holidays for that 2-year period during COVID. What's happened since then, of course, is that, you know, people are allowed to go on holiday abroad again. And all types of accommodation are now open up again. So there has been a slight decrease in the demand, but we're still at much higher levels of demand than we were pre-pandemic. So we're still up on 2019 levels of demand. And, you know, that's probably partly attributable to the fact that during COVID, a lot of people tried camping for the first time. A lot of people went out and bought a tent and now have that tent. And so there's been this kind of residual effect of these people that tried camping for the first time. And now, you know, camping is one of the things that they do as part of their kind of holiday repertoire, or their, their short breaks, whatever they do for the year. And they might include 1 or 2 camping trips alongside their other holidays and activities. So that was a really interesting fallout of the pandemic, was that we have seen this elevated demand for camping. So the next question that people ask is, you know, what's the revenue that you can expect if you offer camping on your land. Some of the campsites that we feature on Hipcamp will be kind of generating revenue of up to £150,000 a year. And it's worth bearing in mind as well that that's just in accommodation, so just the accommodation revenue that would come through Hipcamp. But on top of that, there might be extras and other things that you could do to upsell, and that's become like a really big part of the revenue that some of our landowners and farmers are generating. So all the additional extras, like it could just be kind of logs and fire pits, or activities like bike hire or guided tours or farm tours, fishing. We have some campsites that have a climbing wall. So all kinds of kind of activities and other things that you can upsell as extras. And then the other thing, of course, is produce. So a lot of our campers are living primarily in urban areas, and camping to them is this kind of opportunity to get out into the countryside, into rural areas, and they want to immerse them. They don't just want to sleep in a field, that's part of it, but they want to immerse themselves in being in the countryside. And so if you can offer them the opportunity to experience, 0 food miles produce, or kind of cheese made on your farm, or organic 0 food miles meat that they can cook on the barbecue, which you can also hire them for the day. This is what they want out of their experience. So if you can facilitate that for them, and obviously generate revenue yourself, then that's a kind of win-win situation. But that's a really big part of the experience when we talk about revenue. So we've got an amount up here on the slide, £35,000 to £45,000 a year. So this is actually a statistic from the Camping and Caravanning Club, who did a study on this a short while ago, and this is for a 10-acre site. So at the average income for a good 10-acre site was £35,000 to £45,000 a year. So that gives you a bit of a steer on what kind of level you might expect. But it's very difficult to specify what the revenue would be, because it depends so much on so many things. So location is a big factor. If you're kind of by the coast in Cornwall, or if you're in the Lake District, you can rightfully expect that the demand and therefore revenue would be higher than if you're in not such a kind of well touristed area. But other factors like how much space you have, how many units you have, what type of units, so whether you're just offering camping pitches or whether you're offering, glamping pitches, and then what kind of glamping that is. Is it bell tents or is it tree houses? So all these things kind of feed into what revenue you would expect for the year. And also, of course, how long you're open for. If you're only open for a month, or if you're open for the whole camping season, then these are all things to kind of factor into your business plan. But just as a guide from the Camping and Caravanning Club, that £35,000 to £45,000 a year is a good benchmark for a kind of 10-acre site. Another element worth talking about is the seasonality of camping. So in the UK, the camping season pretty much is the summer. So these revenue figures, they're annual figures, of course, but you're really talking about a limited amount of workload based around the summer months, and that's another kind of consideration that you would need to think about if you're thinking about setting up a campsite. Do you want to be running it for like the whole camping season, which basically in the UK runs from Easter to the end of September? That's the kind of long camping season. There's very few sites that offer camping, especially tent camping, outside of that period. But even within that period, there are many campsites that just open for rather than the whole season. They might just open for the summer holidays. So July and August, maybe the 6 or 8 weeks of summer holidays. And then some campsites might just open for 28 days to benefit from the 28-day planning exemption. So, and we have lots and lots of sites that run a profitable campsite just in that 28-day period. So that's a big part of it as well. But obviously that seasonality means that perhaps you've got other activities that happen at other times of year, and if this fits with your other seasonal activity, then camping could be something to consider. Other than the seasonality, of course, there's an opportunity to use unproductive land. So, for example, some of the most popular hip camps we have are kind of riverside pitches. People love camping by the water, so rivers in particular, but also, lakes or ponds or estuaries. But this might be on a floodplain, for example. So you wouldn't ordinarily want to be planting crops in this area, but it's perfect for kind of accommodating campers for the summer months. So yeah, it gives you an opportunity to use unproductive land, and camping is therefore a kind of really complementary activity, I guess, in terms of land use to your usual farming activities. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention, which is kind of specific to now, I guess, is the amount of support that is available. So obviously, you can get support from platforms like Hipcamp with, the insurance policies and the other support that we offer, but also there's government support available through subsidies and other grants that are being announced. And so, for example, public goods, there's the subsidies now tend to be around performing public goods, and having campers on your land, welcoming the public onto your land is going to dovetail with some of those things that you do get subsidies for. So tree planting, hedge planting, waterways management, all this kind of activity, anything that's reintroducing wildlife onto your land. This is all going to be a really positive thing for campers to experience and enjoy. And it also helps to protect your own natural ecosystem on your land. And it's all aligned with how the subsidies and grants are currently being considered. So it's a really important aspect of it. And for example, this year, if you're in England, so from April, there's the Rural England Prosperity Fund, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. And local regions, they've been allocated their funding. So from April, you'll be able to apply for funding from your local council. So if you're thinking of starting a camping or glamping site, I'd certainly recommend looking into that. And in fact, one of the projects that was recently given funding is directly quoted on the DEFRA prospectus. It's this glamping site that is awarded funding to buy all their glamping accommodation in order to set up their rural accommodation business. And this case study talks about the wider benefits that brings to the local area. So there's some great support out there at the moment to help get you started. So that's just a little bit about why you might want to offer camping. I'll now pass back to John, who is going to talk more about the legal and planning side as you're thinking about opening up a campsite.
Yes, thank you. So as Jonathan said, you've got 28 days for which you can set up a site without requiring planning permission. And as he indicated, during COVID, it was up to 56 days just to help business. And hot off the press, thanks for Hipcamp for mentioning this, the government have a consultation out about extending permitted development rights in this area to 60 days for up to 30 tents. So that might be something worth looking at. But again, permitted development specifically in this area, 28 days per calendar year, and that's all in. So you can't move from field to field, starting the clock again. So that's everything. And the CLA's got more information on permitted development, not just this, but as discussed, any associated development, conversions of old buildings. Again, these are things that are worth looking at. But with the permitted development rights, as well as all planning, it's very specific to what you're looking.
John, I think you've gone on mute.
Shall I step in? I'm meant to be speaking just after John, and I can take control if you want, and come back to John when he's figured out how to get his sound working. Does that work?
Good idea.
If I can have control of the screen. Okay. Just going to skip through John's slides and we'll come back to John if that's okay. And I'll just quickly introduce myself as well. I'm James. I work alongside Jonathan at Hipcamp, and I look after some of our UK communications and activities like this webinar. So what I want to talk about, having talked about why you might want to offer camping on your land, is just to talk about what are some of the different ways that you can approach offering camping for the first time. So there are lots of different kind of business models you might want to look at. And what I've done is just take 4 of the most typical business models that we see. And then I'm going to focus a little bit on the last one in particular as well. So the first option is what I would call high-end, low-volume glamping. So essentially what you're doing here is saying, okay, I don't want to have to deal with lots of people. So what I'm going to do is invest quite a lot of money up front and get some really nice, really expensive kind of glamping pods or shepherd's hut accommodation that I can put on my land. And instead of having lots of people, I'm going to generate my income from having fewer people, but charging a much higher value for that accommodation. And this is really growing in popularity, particularly because of the growth of the glamping industry. And in the long run, it can feel like quite a manageable way of managing the business because you're not going to have so many people on your site. Now, the big downsides to this kind of business model are, the biggest one really is the kind of scale of investment that you're going to need up front. And the fact that it's kind of quite a high risk, high reward model because you're really diving in at the deep end. You're going to invest a lot of money up front. You're going to put in these glamping structures. And so you're really relying on your research that this is going to work. So you really need to make sure you do some thorough research and you're honest with yourself about how much demand there is for your location, how much you can realistically charge for the accommodation you're providing, how long you're going to be able to open for through the year and things like that. And there isn't really a kind of one size fits all kind of model for the whole of the UK. You're going to need to look locally at what you can charge and look in your local area to get an idea of what demand is like. So it's a good model, but it does involve some quite large upfront investments. A second model that we really typically see is what I would call low maintenance caravan parking. And the really well-known organization for this that you'll probably all recognize is the Camping and Caravanning Club. And there's also the Caravan and Motorhome Club. And essentially what these organizations do, and it might be something that John mentions in the planning side of things, is by joining this organization, they can certify you as part of their organization, and it will exempt you from planning permission and campsite licensing and things like that. So you pay an annual fee, you become a part of the Camping Caravanning Club, and they can certify your site. So if you hear of CS sites or CL sites, that stands for certificated site or certificated location. And because the people that are coming are caravanners and motorhomes, they've got on board toilets, showers, things like that. They're quite self-contained. So it's a very low maintenance model. You can really just have a well-drained meadow and you put in some gravel, hard standings and some water pipes to connect to, and you can really be as basic as that. So for real kind of hands-off, low maintenance camping, it's a really popular option. But there are some big downsides to this model in particular. And the biggest downside really is that you are tied in to the organization that certifies you. So in the case of the Camping Caravanning Club, when they certify your site, you also agree that you're not going to advertise on any third-party platforms, take any online bookings or anything like that. So you can't go and advertise yourself to the public and try and grow and increase your revenue. You are kind of fixed to the organization that you're with. And in the case of the Camping Caravanning Club, I think they have a kind of maximum size on a site of maybe 5 or 10 caravans on a CS site. So it's a really good option if you want to have a real hands-off approach and some small subsidiary income. But it's not an option if you really want to grow this kind of farm diversification project into a real income generator, because you're you're stuck at a very small level. The third option is what I've called a kind of large scale temporary campsite. So again, this is what we've already touched on, this idea of the 28-day rule, and operating in this brief 28-day period. And this is really popular with farmers and working farms, where you basically want to say, I don't want to bother with trying to get people booking in spring and autumn and these less high demand times of the year, and I'm just going to focus on that peak period, the school summer holidays. And I'm going to have 28 days where I really maximize the kind of bang for my buck on the land that I'm going to share. The 28 days don't need to be consecutive. So as John mentioned, they do need to be in this, you can't move from field to field and keep topping up your 28 days. But we do have people that spread their 28 days over weekend and close in the period in between. And this is a really popular way of doing things. The main downside, of course, is that you are stuck with a 28-day period, and operationally it's quite intense and there's quite a lot to manage. So you might have a lot of people on your land. The main way to kind of scale your income is having more people. So there's lots of people to manage, and that's probably the biggest kind of downside to this model. But it is really accessible to farmers. And then the fourth typical business model is a little bit of a hybrid, really. And I've called this kind of a long-term family campsite. And it's basically taking that 28-day pop-up campsite model and just thinking a bit more long-term and saying, actually, I don't need to have this really big 28-day site and generate lots of money by having lots of campers. What I'll do is operate a 28-day site on a small manageable scale and not really focus in my first year on having this really big profitable business, but use that as a stepping stone to become a fully licensed, more established family campsite. And this is something really, really common that we see. And so what I've done is broken this down into kind of 3 typical stages. So the first stage, and that might be this summer coming up, is operating this 28-day campsite. And what's good about this, in your first year, you're not going to already have loads of online reviews and a big online presence. You've not got any returning customers. So by operating a 28-day site, again, you're really focusing on that key school summer holiday period. You're making the best use of your land without impacting the rest of your business and the farm and the estate that you're running. So you're really maximizing your occupancy when you know there's demand for camping. And it's really just a testing and learning period. So you're encouraging people to leave reviews, take photos, building a bit of a presence for your campsite. And it's an opportunity for you to learn and think about, where do you want to invest your money? How do you want to go about planning your campsite? And it's also an opportunity to create a bit of a case study of what you want to do, so that when you do come to apply for planning permission or apply for funding, for example, you'll be able to say, this is what I did in this small kind of 28-day test period, and this is what I know that I can do and develop. So in that first year, as well as focusing on your customers, it's also worthwhile focusing on supporting local businesses, directing people to the local pub, keeping that local community on side and in support, so that when you come to apply for your license, local people and there's real local support with you. So that leads on to stage 2. Perhaps you've run your 28-day site for a summer or 2, and then you want to come to applying for planning permission and your campsite license. So you'll go to your local council. You can apply for both planning permission and your campsite license. They kind of are going to complement each other. So if you apply for them both at the same time, that's quite a handy thing to do. But you do need to wait for your planning permission to come through before you apply for your license. So wait for that to come through before you kind of submit the license form. And by getting a campsite license, you're then unlocking these kind of extra benefits. So obviously you can open for longer than 28 days. You can then invest in your facilities, extend your season. And generally these things are going to allow you to charge slightly more for camping and for better facilities, and increase the revenue that you can generate. And there isn't a single kind of blueprint for exactly what you need to do for that. for that license. But in Cornwall, where obviously domestic tourism is a really big part of the industry there, they have published a model standard for applying for a campsite license. So if you just go on Google, if you just search for Cornwall campsite license model standards, you'll be able to find that. We also have a link to it and lots of information about it in our how to start a campsite guide on Hipcamp, which I'll mention at the end as well. But even if you're not in Cornwall, that's a great steer of the kind of things that you can do to make sure you get that license. And then the third and kind of final stage in this sort of evolution is adding glamping to your site. So you know, the great thing about glamping, as I mentioned before, is that from a similar amount of land space, you can charge a lot more and you're going to be able to generate a lot more income. So I looked at some of the nightly values on Hipcamp last summer in July. And you can see that for a tent camping pitch, you're making maybe £30 a night, £35 a night if it's got a caravan on there and probably electricity. But once you look at glamping pods, shepherd's huts, these things are, you know, you're looking upwards of £100 a night. So you can make 3 or 4 times the amount of revenue. So there's obviously these really high values in that glamping proposition. The other thing about glamping is that people generally stay a bit longer because they're that bit more comfortable. So you get slightly longer bookings on your glamping stays. And combined with camping, you're obviously increasing your audience size, because as well as people searching for camping, you've also got people searching for glamping, finding out about you as well. And it is worth noting that in the UK, camping is still by far and away the main audience here, rather than glamping. It is the bigger market share. So about 4 times the number of people are searching for camping on Google in the UK compared to searching for glamping. So by combining these 2 audiences together, you're really kind of maximizing your size. But I think one of the most important things is that point at the end there, going back to what we mentioned before about getting kind of a lot of investment for your glamping and taking an element of risk, is that by adding glamping, having already run some camping on your land, you're making that investment backed by a much better level of knowledge of what it is you offer, what it is campers on your land are looking for. You've got that knowledge to back your investment, and you've got a great idea of how much demand there is for where you are, how much people are willing to pay for things. So you're still adding glamping, but in a slightly less high risk way than if you did that right off the cuff in the first year. And that's not to say that any of those other models are kind of the wrong option to take. These are all just different typical models that we see people taking. Before I hand back to John as well, there was one other thing, is just taking a step back, and before we go thinking about the kind of nitty gritty of setting up your campsite and what you're going to have, is just thinking about what are some of the very first things that you might want to ask yourself and you might want to consider. So the first thing is, as Jonathan alluded to at the beginning, is being honest and realistic about your location and thinking, is there demand for your part of the UK? And really for me, that falls into kind of 3 things. Firstly, are you by the coast? Secondly, are you in or near to a national park? And thirdly, are you in or very well connected to one of the big population areas, London, Manchester, Birmingham, or what have you? And if you fall into one of those 3 categories, then broadly speaking, there's a good chance there's going to be really high demand for your area. But if you don't fall into any of those 3 categories, so that's places like Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, Worcestershire, Cambridgeshire, you need to think about what you can do to help generate that demand if the location itself isn't doing that for you. So it doesn't mean everything's lost, but it does mean you're going to need to work that little bit harder to make some noise and get people thinking about your location. So that might be offering a really spectacular treehouse, or having some sort of theme or niche to your campsite, or a particular element of interaction with the farm that you wouldn't get anywhere else. Those are the kind of things that are going to help generate some demand where the demand isn't naturally there. The second thing I would say to consider at this early stage is where specifically on your land is the site that you want to run your camping or glamping site, and then spend some time there. So a lot of people will you probably already have a bit of an idea of where you might want to do this, but actually go there. If you don't want to pitch a tent, that's fair enough in kind of February, March time. But go down there early in the morning, go down there late in the evening, just spend some time in that area, putting yourself in people's shoes and listen to things, smell things, see things. You'll probably notice things that you haven't noticed up until now if you just spend time there relaxing. There might be loads of road noise that's going to be a real problem, or access issues or something like that. So just do those practical things to understand whether that site is actually going to work for you. And then lastly is thinking about the time involved. And if you run an arable farm and this is going to be happening in the middle of harvest, that's your busy period, how are you going to manage that? Who are you going to get to help you and work with you? And do you have the time and the temperament for this kind of business? At the end of the day, offering camping, yes, people are just sleeping in a field, but this is still part of the hospitality industry. The reviews that we see on Hipcamp of the best Hipcamps are places where people talk about how friendly the host was, how helpful they were, all these kind of things. So are you going to have the time and the temperament to offer to run this kind of campsite? And if you're not, how can you mitigate against that? So it might be just getting other members of your family or people you know to help you out. And it might just be thinking of ways that you can make things a bit less, a bit more contactless. So for example, on Hipcamp, you can have automated emails that send directions and the code to the gate or a key safe or whatever. So that's all kind of done by email and you don't necessarily need to be there at that given time. So those are a few of the top things that I'd recommend certainly kind of thinking about right from the start. I will skip over this to head to John. One last thing that I was going to say was that about that guide that I mentioned. So we've got a kind of PDF, and hopefully it might become a printed booklet that has got lots of information on planning and business rates and when you can open and whether to have Wi-Fi on your campsite, all those kind of things. If you click on this link when the slides get shared with you, you can order a copy of that, and we'll send it over to you in a week or two's time when it's completely ready. And for anything else, you can contact us on CLA@hipcamp.com as well. So if I can hand these slides back over to John and reverse them back to his section, then hopefully we can hear about the planning and legal side of things as well.
Yes, thank you for everyone's patience. Yeah, the joys of running a live event. But it was useful there to get James talking about the business, because the business will impact on your planning. If you're looking to set up a more established site, then it would be useful to get full planning permission. So I will see if I can get back to some of the planning slides. Just answering some of the questions that I saw during the event in the chat. So with the 28 days rule, you will need to follow the specific pieces of legislation which are based on the bottom there. So glamping and caravans are treated separately. So depending on what you're looking to achieve, it's worth looking at the specific pieces of legislation. And the 28-day rule, you don't need to comply with nutrient neutrality. So the whole point of the 28-day rule is not to get bogged down in the planning system and not to bog down the planning system itself. But that being said, in the extreme, you will have to comply with wider pieces of legislation relating to pollution as well as cross-compliance. In a few rare cases, you may not be able to make use of the 28-day rule here. So there are a few exclusions. So one of which is an Article 4 direction. This is where your local council or the Secretary of State can remove the 28-day rule rights within a specific location. This is usually to protect a historic site or a site of scientific interest. But again, you can also check your own farm or property's planning history, because any previous applications that were permitted may have a planning condition that removes certain permitted development rights. And so moving on to full planning permission. So anything beyond 28 days, and that includes different uses on the land. So camping or running different events, they all contribute towards the 28-day rule. So you need full planning permission. Many of you will be aware that this is a difficult process, but it does give you certainty if you look to exceed the 28 days. And again, any infrastructure associated with the development. So I believe I saw information about asking about concrete pads in the question. That would need full planning permission because it's going to be there year round. And the source of this requirement is section 55. So you need full planning permission if you're going to be doing any building, engineering works, or changes of use. And that would require full planning permission. So you wouldn't need be able to use the 28-day rule here. So an example would be a track leading towards a glamping site. If this is a new track, which is just serving a glamping site, even if that site is only there for 28 days in a year, you would still need full planning permission for the track. And the burden of proof is on you, the applicant, especially if you're in a protected area such as a national park or an area of outstanding natural beauty. So you need to comply with the council as well as national planning policies and put in a quality planning application to get that permission. And there's a whole host of application requirements and a validation checklist, which any of you who have gone through the planning process will potentially grumble about. So a full planning application should take about 8 weeks for a decision to be made, although due to pressures, it is taking longer. So a little example here of the sorts of information you would be supplying in a full planning application, which you wouldn't have to in a 28-day site use. So site plan, application plan, and statements justifying your application. And the council can be very pernickety about what is required, because you don't want to submit a planning application, wait 1 week for them to say you haven't ticked all of our boxes and you need to submit a valid planning application. So it's lots of little things such as having a correct scale and north point. And so moving on to caravans, again, it's very dependent on the use. So James mentioned the different organizations that you can go through, such as a caravan and camping club. And I'd recommend that you speak to them directly with any thoughts, and they can help you to frame a proposal. And so the use depends on essentially the specifics of the case, whether you're going to be using it seasonally for farm workers, friends, family, or just in association with a glamping site. And all of these things will impact your planning requirements as well as a license, which usually you would do in the same time. And the CLA has its very own specific guidance note on the matter, which we encourage you to read in greater detail. But it isn't just planning that you will need to consider, as any site will automatically become liable for business rates, although there is a threshold. So this is a tax payable to your local council, and it's based on the hypothetical rent, and they have their own formula, and unfortunately nothing with the council is ever easy. But again, you can look at the CLA website for more information, as well as the VOA, so that's the Valuation Office Agency, to look at comparable sites, but most glamping sites will be below the threshold. You'll also need to consider insurance. You'll be having guests on the site, and you'll need to have the appropriate policy and levels of public indemnity. and you may look to have other insurance cover. So whether that's business disruption, and again, Hipcamp and the CLA can help you in this area as well. And so associated with that is health and safety. You might be having farming operations, harvest, lambing going on at the same time as camping. So it's vital that you have all of your checks and have it down in writing, because if anything was to go wrong, if you can't evidence that you've taken reasonable steps to get rid of any risk, then you could potentially be in trouble. And then the final one, this is linked back to planning, is access. If you're in the countryside and you've only got a single lane access, then that will limit your potential of gaining full planning application. So you may have to think about whether you can get a caravan, a shepherd's hut up the lane, or just whether having 30 campsites, or sorry, 30 tents would be too much, because the council may only permit a handful of cars coming up and down the lane. So that is finishing this talk, and unfortunately not the correct order, but I would now like to go towards the questions. And I'd like to start off with James. You had a list of all of the potential incomes per night, and I was just wondering what kind of range off of that average would you expect to see?
Yeah, so do you mean in terms of, that's just an average, where's the lowest figure and what would the highest kind of figure be for glamping?
Yes, as well as any geographical differences.
Yeah, I mean, the range is vast, partly because of the diversity of glamping accommodation. So at the bottom end, you can set up a bell tent and just put some kind of air beds in it, and you can charge more for that because it's all pre-pitched and ready for someone than you can for camping, but you're not going to be able to charge hundreds of pounds. So the lowest kind of level of glamping, you're still going to be charging maybe 40 or 50 pounds a night. And then the highest end of the range can be, for some of the really spectacular tree houses that we see, where you've got, a tree house with full insulation, a hot tub on the veranda and stuff like that. We're talking kind of, £400 a night. So the range really is massive. And that's where, as I say, that kind of local research comes into play at looking at the things to look at when you're thinking about your pricing are looking within your local area. So if someone's charging hundreds of pounds for a shepherd's huts in Cornwall, as Jonathan mentioned, but you're in Norfolk, then that's not really a fair comparison. So you want to look within your local area at kind of who your competition is, who you're competing with, what the kind of pricing ranges are in your local area. The other thing, obviously, is to look at similar structure types or similar levels of kind of comfort. So if you've got a shepherd's hut, but it doesn't have ensuite facilities, you don't want to compare that with a shepherd's hut that has ensuite facilities. So make sure you're making kind of clear comparisons in terms of the type of accommodation you offer as well. And then the third thing I sometimes say to people is kind of, once you've got that sort of range that you're thinking of offering for your accommodation, and you're unsure where exactly to put yourself within it, in your first year, you're much better off kind of ever so slightly, accidentally underpricing yourself than accidentally overpricing yourself. Because if you accidentally overprice yourself, you're not going to have lots of people coming, generating that income. You're not going to have people coming, leaving reviews, building up your kind of online presence on and getting you that publicity. And you're also not necessarily going to be knowing what's wrong with your business. Why is it that you've not got lots of people coming? If you accidentally underprice your offering, then the worst thing that's going to happen is you get loads of people booking, you get loads of over demand because you're really great value for what you've got. You get loads of online reviews, loads of people saying how great you are, and then you learn from that actually you should probably be charging a bit more, and you increase your kind of your charging a little bit. So yeah, the conservative thing to do, although you've got this kind of business plan and you want to make sure you kind of make back the investment that you've made, that kind of always pushes you towards charging higher values. And the people selling you the pods and the shepherd's huts, they're telling you these great numbers you can charge. But actually, if you're unsure, going to the lower end of your bracket in your first year is always the safer thing to do, because it's easy to go up from there, and it's much harder to climb down from a really high position when you've lost that kind of impact that you should have in your first year.
Thank you. I'm going to put two questions together here, and if I could direct it towards Jonathan, that would be great. A question: does having non-family sites make a difference? So having no children about, and also how do you police bad behaviour on a campsite?
Yes. So well, I'm not really 100% sure about what the question is asking about. Will a non-family site make a difference? If we're talking about will it make a difference to demand, then yes. We do find that we have a small collection of adult-only sites, and they don't tend to take as many bookings, obviously, as the family sites. I mean, you know, Hipcamp as a brand, the audience is generally speaking, but it's very family oriented for the summer months, and then outside of peak season, we do get a lot more kind of couples and you know, just two adults together taking trips. But on the whole, if you're looking for maximum occupancy, a family camping site is obviously going to be easier to get higher occupancy. I'm not sure if I've answered, you know, the question correctly there. Sorry, John, what was the second part of that question?
Well, you've answered both parts. So the first part was about essentially, yeah, the demand having essentially cutting out families and children from the market and how that will impact the business. And then the second part was about bad behavior and policing that. Okay, yeah. So I mean, bad behavior, slightly different thing. On Hipcamp, we allow you to present, you know, certain policies. So and campers have to agree to these policies before they make a booking, and those policies generally would include, you know, any kind of clauses around bad behavior. I've got to say, you know, we've been doing this for many years, and I can count on one hand the number of times that we've had issues with bad behavior. So I wouldn't say that the worry of bad behavior should put you off from setting up a campsite, because it really isn't something that we've had to kind of deal with in a very meaningful way over the last 10-15 years. James, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I don't think so, and I think you're right. You know, a big part of it is just how you kind of position yourself as a campsite. If you're quite clearly a kind of quiet site or a family campsite, then you do find that people kind of recognize that just from the photos. And as I say, you know, these days other people's reviews are a really big way that people make their kind of choices. So if you've got lots of reviews from families saying what a lovely family site it is, then you don't get big kind of stag do's descending on the place. So how you market yourself and showcase yourself actually does most of the work for you in terms of the kind of people that are going to stay with you.
Just to jump into the questions, I can see that there's a few questions around the 28-day rule and about toilets in particular. So John, shall I just address that? I mean, you've obviously spoken a bit about that, but with the 28-day rule, if you're thinking about running a campsite under the 28-day rule, I mean, the two main ways to look at facilities, and just to reiterate what was said earlier, you can't set up any proper infrastructure. So a new shower block or toilet block under the 28-day rule is just not going to be possible. What most people do under the 28-day rule is they either ship in these portable kind of festival type toilets and showers, and you can get some really good ones these days, like really kind of almost kind of quite luxurious top quality units. So shipping those in for your 28-day period that is one of the easiest ways to do it. But do bear in mind that, as someone has mentioned actually on the chat here, any day that you have that on your land counts as a day of your 28 days. So you can't, you don't want to get it delivered a week before you start accepting campers. You want to get it delivered, the day before you open for the season, something like that. The other way to do it is compost loos. And this has become actually quite a popular thing. Kind of sustainable living, leaving no trace, low impact camping. People have kind of warmed to the idea of compost loos now in a very big way, and you'll find them on a lot of sites. So there isn't such a stigma about compost loos as there used to be. And you can get ones that, that don't smell and, are actually quite attractive and quite pleasant to use. So I would say look at the idea of compost loos as well. In most cases, I can't, obviously different local authorities have different views, but we certainly have many campsites who have taken the view that building these kind of sheds with a compost loo inside is permitted under permitted development. You would have to kind of take your own view on that, but we certainly have many sites who have taken that view. And then that would provide you with compost loos on the site, and then you wouldn't have to kind of rent the portable toilets and showers. The other thing I wanted to mention about the 28-day rule, which I think you mentioned, John, but just to reiterate, in most cases you wouldn't be able to use that if you're in a national park, as far as I'm aware. And if you're in an area of outstanding natural beauty, I would recommend checking with your local authority and actually seeking permitted development authorization if you're thinking of doing anything in an area of outstanding natural beauty, because I know that some local authorities don't consider that this 28-day rule is permitted in those areas. I don't know, John, if you've got anything to add on that.
No, I think that's a great base. I think for any specific questions, and also if you're across different borders, it's worth looking at it in more detail and perhaps speaking to your local CLA office or Hipcamp separately so that we can give you the time required. Just finally, I'd quite like to ask James about, you mentioned the different business models. What one do you think would be most appropriate this year and have changes in the economy? So the base rate increasing, will that impact on investment and the choice of business model?
I'm not sure. I don't personally know enough about the kind of changes in base rates to talk about how that would impact things. For me, I mean, one of the reasons that I focused on the final model and the kind of the different stages of that is that I think for right now it is a fairly timely model for 2023. I know it doesn't suit everyone, the kind of temporary site, because there are a few exceptions to that. But the great thing about, if you were to start this year and operate a 28-day temporary campsite, as I said, it kind of allows you to build a bit of a case study. And certainly if you're looking to apply for, like if you're in England and you're looking to apply for the Rural England Prosperity Fund that Jonathan mentioned at the beginning, then essentially if you run your 28-day site this summer, and then use that as a sort of case study for your application in the autumn, the period for submissions, I think for that is from April this year through to 2024. So if you run your site temporarily this summer and then learn from that, this is what I want to develop my campsite into, and use that as a case study, talk about those things that I mentioned, how it supported the local economy, it drove, lots of people to the local pub and it helped them and what have you. Those things are going to really, really put you in a great position for applying for that Rural England Prosperity funding this kind of autumn time, for when that kind of stuff is during this award period. So that's a model that I kind of like the sound of for the kind of camping side of things for 2023, just because of the kind of shift in funding that's out there. But as I said, you know, that the difficult thing about doing a kind of national webinar about camping, glamping is that there are so many different options. It is so diverse. It is so local to you and how you kind of want to operate on your farm. But yeah, hopefully those different kind of examples are useful to people.
Yes, thank you for that. And it's worth reminding everyone that this webinar has been recorded and it should go online in the next few days. And we'll try and get back to some of you with the questions that haven't been answered today. One thing I would like to say is thank you very much for Hipcamp for joining the CLA today. And final request, we have a short questionnaire and we'd be most grateful if you could scan the code and fill it in. I believe it's only about 2 minutes, so we'd be grateful if you could do this. So thank you all for attending today. Sorry, Jonathan, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I was just gonna mention, James, you mentioned previously about the guide to setting up a campsite, which we're offering, but have we provided the URL for people to sign up to that?
Yeah, there's a link in the slides here, and people, when the slides will be sent out, so people can head to that as well.
Perfect.
And, when the deck gets shed.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
That's great. So thank you all for attending today, and we'll now close this webinar.